Hello and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today we have a very intriguing guest, direct from the Czech Republic. Igor Prusa is a PhD and a Czech scholar in Japanese and media studies, currently affiliated with Olympus University Prague and Metropolitan University Prague. Prusa received 2 PhDs, one in media studies at Prague's Charles University and his second one at University of Tokyo. His research interests include media scandals in Japan and anti-heroism in popular fiction. His book, Scandal in Japan, Transgression, Performance, and Ritual, was released by Routledge in 2024, and he is also, interestingly, a guitarist and music composer in a Japan-themed band. Today we're going to talk about some Japanese scandals that have gone global and why. We'll talk about the Unification Church scandal in 2022 that was brought to the forefront by the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. We'll also talk about the Olympus scandal of 2011 that was triggered by the British CEO Michael Woodford. Lastly, we'll talk about the Nissan scandal of 2019 that involved CEO Carlos Ghosn. So get ready to join the wild and crazy ride with Igor Prusa in this episode of the Books on Asia podcast. The Books on Asia podcast is sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine quality books on Asia for over 30 years. So welcome, Igor.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Now, today we're going to talk about your book, Scandal in Japan, Transgression, Performance, and Ritual. And what I love about that title is the performance and ritual part, because that's the part that is so Japanese, right? The ritual. And I know that so many people, when they come to Japan, if you turn on the TV and the news, will often see CEOs or other people bowing and apologizing for transgressions. And so I think that's just the perfect title. Now, this is a bit of an academic book, but it really hits to the core of Japanese culture. And that's what I really liked about it, because it's always been a mystery to me as to what's going on with all of these apologies and such on TV. And you really crystallize that and explain what's happening. I really appreciated that, because I think these are really big topics that are often hard to, put into something, short and pithy. But actually, your book, it's 100 pages, but it does the best job. What is the definition of a scandal? And then, of course, the Zen question, like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? So is it still a scandal if you don't hear about it?
Let me start with the second question. Is it still a scandal if you don't hear about it? No, it is not. Scandal, by definition, is something that must be revealed to the public, and it must be attributed to at least one elite individual. The commoners do not really count. Then it must be mediated it must be framed by the media organizations. Namely, the media are indicating who's the villain and who's the victim there in the moral narrative. The public must react to the scandal. If the public doesn't react, if the public doesn't feel a moral indignation, then there is no scandal at all. So my answer to your question would be, if we don't hear about some transgression, in other words, violation of norms, conventions, rules, if we don't hear about the transgression, it is not a scandal. It is just some action that was not recognized as transgression. It is only through the media that we find out about certain transgression. And if and only if the public reacts, then a scandal is born. As a conclusion, there should be some sanctions. Symbolic sanctions, such as loss of face, position, status, and of course legal sanctions, usually suspended sentences, detention, fines. One last thing, scandal is no new word. This is not a new definition. We can go back to the Bible, where scandal or in biblical parlance, skandalon is a stumbling block, something that blocks you from the faith, something that offends the transcendent God.
Now, in the beginning of your book, you admit that you were never really interested in scandals. So what was the turning point there for you to become so keenly interested in this?
In the beginning, I was studying for my first PhD at Charles University, Prague. I was studying Japanese media organizations. How does the Japanese media function in Japan? Surely you will bump into the topic of scandal, because as you correctly noted in the beginning, there is a scandal every week. I'm counting 1 week a scandal, so the frequency is really high. So there is something important about scandals. I thought so. But the moment when I found out that I have to dig deep was the drug scandal of one famous Japanese celebrity, Sakai Noriko, and it was a drug scandal. And I was living back then in the Odaiba dorm. Odaiba is an artificial island in Tokyo Bay, and there is a dormitory of the University of Tokyo, and I lived there. And in one summer morning, I woke up, and my place was circled by helicopters. It looked like some serial killer, because so many helicopters, and why is it around my place? Well, the answer is that right next to my place there was a detention center in Odaiba, and this little pure celebrity, Sakai Noriko, was detained there, right next to my place. So, of course, the helicopters were there in order to offer this glimpse, this God's perspective from the heavens. Where exactly is the transgressor dwelling? I come from the Czech Republic, as you mentioned in the beginning, and as you know, this is a post-communist country where, of course, there are no helicopters. And especially there are no helicopters out there because some celebrity takes 0.008 grams of some stimulant, of some drug. I have realized that the scandals are moving the Japanese society. So I decided to go deeper and find out what is it that is moving Japanese society and the Japanese media in particular to behave as they behave during Japanese scandals.
Scandals, they give us an insight into the Japanese culture, right? Mm-hmm. And they reflect the morals, values, and expectations of a society. And Sakai Noriko was not expected to do those kinds of things, I suppose.
You're right, because scandals really, they seem to be insignificant. They seem to be, some disturbances in media reality. But as a matter of fact, if you look deeper below the surface, you realize that scandals actually manage and manifest transgressions. So there is this contradiction, because on the one side you have the consensus and harmony as one of the key Japanese values, right. And on the other side you have constant conflict and constant scandalization. So I was surprised by the contradiction. And of course, the conclusion is that Japan as a harmonious and consensual country is a famous stereotype that must be at least partially overcome in the light of the findings from the research such as mine. In other words, that research that focuses not on consensus but on conflict. And I thought, and I still do believe, we will get much more information and knowledge about the country, the society, which produces those scandals. So it may be much more telling to focus on the ways how the Japanese society manifests and manages scandals, or in other way, how the Japanese society deals with a crisis.
So in your book, you say that you approach scandals as framed narratives and media events. Mm-hmm. So can you explain these two approaches before we get into the nitty-gritty of some of the more famous scandals?
Definitely. If I talk about Japanese scandal as a narrative, that's basically the case that scandals must come in a form of it's a morality tale. In other words, there is a clash of good and evil. And the conclusion should be that the evil person, the transgressor, should be punished. And if we do so, we maintain the good, sacred society. So the narrative is basically people telling stories about themselves to themselves. This is what Clifford Geertz would say, the famous anthropologist. And the narrative of scandal is always moving from the initial equilibrium, normal state, toward disequilibrium, that's the revealed conflict, and then eventually back to the equilibrium. So that's the return to the status quo. So narrative is a story of good and evil, and of disintegration, that's the scandal, and renewal, that's the return to normality. And in my book, I mentioned that these narratives must be framed. Always framing is important. Because if the media give you the message as it is, somebody did something, the people will not perceive the story of good and evil in there unless the scandal is framed somehow. The media add something to the story. Because the frames, and they can be audio-visual frames, the way the television angle can be a form of frame. The sound can be a form of frame. And frames sort of suggest meanings by framing the news accordingly. And in Japanese scandal, there are usually two frames, the guilt frame and the excuse frame. If the media start applying the guilt frame, that means, for example, that they start using a special language to describe the scandal and the transgressor. So, for example, the Japanese media like to frame some scandal as inappropriate, contemptible, unforgivable, anti-social, and this is the linguistic framing. And once you do this frame, you basically fix the guilt. It is the media framing that decides if the public feels some moral indignation. And the last point, you mentioned scandals as media events. That is, media event is a usually pre-planned coverage of a certain real event. And this event is shaped as a ceremony. Or, in my understanding, it's a media ritual. The media events are not created by one single person, but it is constituted by the network of people. The organizers of the event, the sponsors of the event, and, importantly, the broadcasters. And media event is basically the final product of the whole mediation process. It's everywhere. Everybody knows about that, and it's becoming a huge thing. And many of those events are, as I would argue in my book, pseudo-events. These tearful press conferences are not real events, meaning that they bring some new knowledge or they make somebody smarter. No, these are just rituals that need to be done in order to purify the transgressor and possibly return him or her to the professional platform. But in the media, the event is usually a pseudo-event, and these media events are very often spectacles. They are spectacular. There are lights, there are hundreds of cameramen, reporters. Everybody knows. Nobody is surprised. And this is why I would argue that many Japanese scandals are spectacular pseudo-events. And the ultimate form of this spectacular media event is the so-called mega-spectacle. This is the term by Douglas Kellner, who is a great cultural critic. And mega-spectacle, this is the moment where, first of all, the scandal becomes a common knowledge. And secondly, it spreads to the outside countries, becoming a global scandal. And finally, these global spectacles or mega spectacles, they stay with the society for longer periods of time, and they can have some impact on the culture and society per se. They can be transformative.
Before we go any further, what about the Unification Church scandal of 2022 that brought to the forefront the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo? Which camp would you put that one into?
This scandal was a little different and specific because usually the media scandal in Japan starts with a fishy magazine bringing some gossip into the fore, and if this becomes huge, then a scandal can catch on. But in the Unification Church scandal, the trigger was a tragedy, the assassination of former Prime Minister. So it was not based on tabloid gossiping, but based on the hard news. And this is, of course, the case where you cannot silence the media anymore. Everybody wants to cover this thing. And the Unification Church scandal uncovered huge corruption of religion and politics. And this is something people do not talk about much because it's a sensitive topic in Japan. But with the assassination of Abe Shinzo, this collusion became uncovered, and a huge scandal was triggered only because it was revealed that every second lawmaker of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party of Japan, every second member has connections to the church, to the religious cults, to the religious organizations. The cult, the sect, the church supports the politicians in the next elections. So there is this reciprocity which maintains the corruption ever since the beginning of, let's say, the end of Second World War. So this was something really huge. One important thing was, and I always look at how the scandal actors, the government, the media, the church, how they react to the scandal. And the government was rather defensive. They didn't want to admit that things are wrong. So the big media were maintaining the status quo, which is usually the case, but the small tabloid media were revealing the information, and the scandal was growing. And again, in Japanese scandals, you often have something which I call the outside pressure. Japan itself doesn't want to change itself necessarily from the inside, but very often when there is a pressure from the outside, for example, some outside media, foreign media cover the scandal, then the Japanese media have to catch up as well because it would be a shame. It would be, And that was the case of the Unification Church as well. The Japanese media, the mainstream media, were mute, while it was the French media outlets that were the first one detailed information about the scandal. And one last thing about the scandal which is specific is that the assassin, the person who assassinated Abe Shinzo, became, for some Japanese, a folk hero. He's a national hero for some Japanese precisely because he uncovered this collusion and corruption of political power and religious power. So that's some people perceive that as absurd.
And his mother was directly involved,
exactly.
Right?
His mother.
So he had this inside information.
Exactly. Her mother was basically the victim of the church, and she dedicated most of her savings to the church, which is something you have to do after a couple of weeks after you enter the Unification Church. But of course it was destructive, and the assassin, his family collapsed. So it was, I would say it was a mega scandal, but it was not a typical Japanese scandal, which I'm describing in my books.
So let's briefly touch on the Olympus scandal of 2011, which was triggered by the British CEO Michael Woodford.
That scandal was quite a typical Japanese scandal, according to my book. The problem was that Olympus was hiding losses for decades, for a long, maybe over 20 years' time. And there were all kinds of mechanisms for hiding losses, including the so-called creative accounting, which is basically a false accounting, and all kinds of mergers and acquisitions. Olympus was buying companies for incredibly inflated price for no reason. And Michael Woodford discovered this mechanism. of hiding losses. And if he would be a typical Japanese CEO, he would, of course, keep it for himself and he would accept things as they are. That's the status quo. But Michael Woodford did not want to go along with the system. That's how the scandal exploded, because he became a key whistleblower. He blew the whistle. And here, this is important, the mainstream media were silent when the scandal erupted. In my framework, I distinguish between the inside media and outside media. The inside media are those mainstream mass media, such as Yomiuri Shimbun, the mainstream dailies and the mainstream television, while the outside media are the weeklies, the monthlies, the foreign media, importantly, the online communities, and so on. And in Japan, it is almost always the case that a scandal is triggered by the outside media, and only then the inside media follow with a certain delay. So this was the case of Olympus scandal, because the whistleblower, the very first unnamed whistleblower who was a company member, blew the whistle. And he did it through a Japanese economic monthly magazine called Facta. And only then did the Financial Times cover the scandal. Michael Woodford contacted the Financial Times. He knew that he would have no chance if he contacted the mainstream big dailies, including the mainstream economic daily, which is the most responsible daily, or should be, in corporate governance and corporate scandal. So this newspaper stayed mute for 1 week. They kept the see no evil approach, and they didn't want to admit. They said there were some confusions in the management, but they did not admit the scandal. And Michael Woodford, he pushed through as a foreign boss, which is something obviously different from the Japanese boss, and he became the key whistleblower through the outside media. And only after the scandal grew big, again, there was this external outside pressure because of the Financial Times, only then did the scandal become a reality for the Japanese audiences. And one last thing, Michael Woodford, I met with Michael Woodford the other day in Prague, and I asked him about the future of corporate governance and whistleblowing. And he gave me an advice. If you are in Japan, never blow the whistle, because you go against the wall, you go against the system. You may win the argument, but you will not win the war.
Very interesting. Okay, and then how about the Nissan scandal? Because that one was huge. And again, involving another CEO, this time Carlos Ghosn. And that was, this is your mega scandal for sure.
Yes, definitely.
So do you have some insight on that one for us?
Definitely. What was interesting about the scandal? First of all, we have this person of Carlos Ghosn. Carlos Ghosn is a French-Lebanese car maker, automaker, the CEO of Renault, and he actually basically saved Japan from the automobile crisis back in the beginning of 2000. So Carlos Ghosn was a folk hero. He was a national hero. Even the ordinary Japanese called him Ghosn-san or Ghosn-sama, Mr. Ghosn or His Excellency Ghosn. Ghosn was the savior of Japanese automotive industry. However, the problem was that he allegedly, according to the prosecutors, was stealing money from Nissan and from Renault and putting it into his own pockets. And I'm talking about amounts that are worth millions and millions of dollars. The problem behind behind scandals, you usually have some conflict, some background conflict. And only against this backdrop, the media scandal emerges. And in case of the Nissan scandal, there was a conflict between the Japanese governance and the global or French governance, because there was a plan to merge together Renault, the French car maker, and Nissan, the Japanese car maker. And the Nissan people didn't like the idea. They wanted to keep Nissan as a pure Japanese company, with all the pride attached to it and so on. But Carlos Ghosn was trying to merge these two companies. And that was, allegedly, why Carlos Ghosn was shut down by his own people. There was a lot of backstabbing, but his own colleagues, people he helped to rise in the hierarchy, his own colleagues stabbed him in the back. They went to the prosecutors. They told them all the things they knew about the accounting, the so-called creative accounting of Carlos Ghosn, and it became an incredible scandal. So importantly, in scandals in general, and in this scandal in particular, there is always some collision against the backdrop of the scandal. In case of this scandal, it was a collision between people, between the law system, between the justice system, and between the culture as such. So it was a huge global scandal. But basically, the very beginning of the scandal was a relatively small issue. It was in 2010 when there was a change in the law, in the corporate law, based on which the biggest CEOs must show how much money they are getting. And all of a sudden, the whole of Japan found out that Carlos Ghosn was living like a king of Versailles. He was like an aristocrat. He was so detached from the people based on those numbers that the Japanese sentiment turned against him, thanks to the Japanese media showing Ghosn as a spoiled, rich, basically perpetrator. That was the image. And there were all kinds of issues around the scandal. Scandal has the main line, narrative line, and then there are some sub-dramas and sub-scandals and so on. One of those sub-scandals was that Carlos Ghosn was holding a great party for the company at Versailles Palace, the Palace of Versailles in France, the famous Versailles. So Carlos Ghosn was this corrupted king. Everybody was wearing the 18th century costumes. Carlos Ghosn was the King Louis the 16th or whatever. And this was showed, and when the Japanese public saw this, they realized that he's a spoiled, rich perpetrator who is trying to bring down this beautiful Japanese company called Nissan by merging it with this French Renault company. So as you can see, there are more layers to the scandal, but the end line is that we cannot really say if Carlos Ghosn was a victim or a perpetrator. It really looks like he was both at the same time. And if somebody wants to read more about this scandal, there is a wonderful book which is called Collision Course by Hans Greimel and William Sposato. And this book is going deep into details, explaining everything about the scandal.
Great. Okay. Yeah, it was certainly a fascinating media spectacular. And I would love to read more about it. And I kept thinking, a couple of the Japan authors were going to come out with something, but nothing has surfaced yet. It's unfortunately we're running out of time. But the last question I always ask is, what are your 3 favorite books on Japan? And I know it's not fair.
Of course. I will not comment on how impossible this is. I will just give you 3 books that influenced me a lot in the way I think about, many Japanese scandals. The first book would be The Journalist, which is a Japanese book. In Japanese, originally it's called Shimbun Kisha. That's the word for a journalist. And it was written by Isoko Mochizuki. And Isoko Mochizuki is a special person in Japanese media. She is from Tokyo Shimbun, which is one of those rather liberal newspapers in Japan. And Isoko Mochizuki is really strong. She's a strong person. She has some feminist background a bit, but that's all good. And she's fighting against the corrupt and unjust authorities. She's the one who's attacking the spokesperson during the cabinet press meetings. She's giving the unpleasant questions. And thanks to Isoko Mochizuki, many scandals were born, including the Moritomo Gakuen scandal or the school scandals of the Prime Minister Abe Shinzo.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
and also, Isoko Mochizuki, she helped a lot during the first Me Too scandal in Japan, which was the infamous Shiori Ito rape scandal in Japan. That was 2017, and it is sometimes said as the first, but unfortunately the last Me Too scandal in Japan. And Isoko Mochizuki was helping the victim, Miss Shiori Ito, in spreading her word. And she was successful in this endeavor, and that's why Ito Shiori case is known globally. So that would be the first book. The second book I mentioned is from, I believe that was Media and Politics in Japan. That's a book for all those who want to really get the basics of how media work in Japan and how the media cover politics. It was written by Susan Farr and Alice Krauss. These are among the prominent Japanese scholars that also focus on Japanese media and politics. And it is from the year 1996. And simply, this book is my favorite because it includes one chapter on political scandals written by Maggie Farley. And that chapter in that book was the trigger for me to actually, based on that chapter, I also decided to go this way and to cover Japanese scandals, which that's why. But if anybody wants to read about the problems regarding media and politics, this book is the best. It's a classic book. And the last book I mentioned is called Idols and Celebrity in Japanese Media Culture. And it was written by my classmate from the University of Tokyo, Patrick Galbraith, who is the biggest otaku expert, the Japanese nerds, the subcultures. Mm-hmm. And he wrote it together with Jason Carling, who was my sub-advisor at the University of Tokyo. And I contributed with a chapter on the Sakai Noriko scandal, which we were touching upon a little earlier. So I liked, this book is close to my heart because it basically started my career publishing scandals. And at the same time, the book is a perfect introduction for everybody who wants to understand the role of the idol, the celebrity in Japanese culture.
Oh, right.
And that's super important for understanding scandals. Because the idol, as you know, must be pure, innocent, almost virginal if possible. No dating, no sex, no nothing. And of course, if the purity is somehow damaged through a revealed transgression, a huge celebrity scandal is generated. And these scandals, they can be followed by almost one half of the Japanese populace when they are on the television, when the celebrities are crying, bowing, it becomes a spectacle. Or, as Luke Boltanski would say, it becomes a spectacle of suffering. And here we can, how much of Schadenfreude, how much of this inherent feeling of us is in there. Some of us may enjoy the fall of others. My supervisor from Todai criticized me. He said, no, the Japanese have no such thing as Schadenfreude. We don't appreciate the fall of others. So I was even fighting because of this issue at the University of Tokyo. And I still do think that I am more right than the Tokyo professors. But by saying this, I may be creating yet another scandal. So I will rather.
Okay, great. Good. So thanks so much for being on the podcast, Igor. Do not forget to pick up his book, Scandal in Japan, Transgression, Performance, and Ritual, available on Amazon and I suppose in bookstores too. It's put out by Routledge Press. And also, I would recommend that people follow you on LinkedIn as well, because I love your LinkedIn posts, because you're talking about the weekly scandal and you really go into quite a bit of depth. And also, I like it because you put in the Japanese words too that are related to scandals.
The linguistic analysis is important because, as I mentioned in the beginning, the linguistic framing decides how a scandal will be interpreted and judged. So that's why I'm trying to show those words that actually change things. Only by saying them sometimes, it's a performative speech act and things actually happen.
Yeah, that's right. It's all language related, isn't it? And it gives people cues, right, onto which way they're going to go with it. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It was my greatest pleasure to be part of this wonderful podcast.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.